I'd like to read to you from this book by Anne Fadiman. It's called Ex Libris, Confessions of a Common Reader. And the essay I'm going to read to you is called Sharing the Mayhem. When Charles Dickens read aloud from Oliver Twist to a full house at St. James Hall, his heart rate shot up from 72 to 124, and no wonder. Don't you already know she has something much more interesting to say than I do? First, he became Fagin. His friend Charles Kent, who watched him from the wings, said that for several minutes, Dickens resembled the very devil incarnate. His features distorted with rage, his penthouse eyebrows working like the antennae of some deadly reptile, his whole aspect half vulpine, half vulture-like in its hungry wickedness. It might accelerate anyone's pulse to look like a reptile, a mammal, and a bird simultaneously. Then, after glancing at the stage directions he had written in the margins, shudder, look around with terror, murder coming, Dickens became Bill Sykes, wielding an invisible club. Finally, he became Nancy, gasping, "Bill, dear Bill," as she sank to the floor, blinded by her own blood. After bludgeoning Nancy and hanging Sykes, Dickens prostrated himself on a sofa off stage, unable to speak in consecutive sentences for a full 10 minutes. When I read the story of a fierce bad rabbit to my son last night, there was no one around to check my pulse. However, Beatrix Potter and Charles Dickens seemed to have attended the same violent writer's school, and when I got to the part where the man with the gun blasts off the rabbit's tail and whiskers, bang, I can tell you that Henry and I were both breathing pretty heavily. Private readings have certain advantages over public ones. We were both already prostrate, and had I been unable to speak in consecutive sentences, Henry never would have noticed. I was also able to insert editorial comments such as, "It wasn't a real gun." After describing the pool of gore that quivered and danced in the sunlight, Dickens could not turn to his audience, even though a physician had forecast mass hysteria among the women, and say, "It wasn't real gore." When Todd asked me that if I might like to do this, I said, "Yeah, but I don't want to do anything digital." And I am very glad I didn't, because there's lots of reasons I'm glad, but more than anything, I just, the folks are moving ahead, and you got to catch up. There's a lot of ways in which I've let my own website coast, and I see all these things that I'm not doing, and it's really nice to hear that. And I said I want to talk about reading aloud to students. And this is something I do several times during the semester, and he said, "Well, why do you do that?" And then I think it was Dean Holbrook who sent out a thing to us about a recent study asking, what do students want from their faculty? And it was comparing classroom online. But in the whole study, the things that made sense to me, when we asked what students want, and I think students might want a lot of things, but what part of that is part of being a good teacher? Here's one of the things that made sense to me. Students want somebody who knows their subject. And they want somebody who is organized. I don't think that reading aloud to your students will help with these things. And these are the fundamentals, and if they're not there, don't turn to reading to your students aloud from some book to try and fix that. Not that they can ever be perfect, right? We all need to keep on working on these. They want respect, and I'm going to just talk about that one in a minute. I'm not even sure if I know what it means, but we can talk a little bit about that. And then they want somebody who's engaging. And that's the one that I struggle with, and I have to imagine many of us do. In fact, I think that the people who get paid to do nothing more than be engaging, they don't even have to do all of this, but they see their audience every day. The people like Jay Leno or David Letterman or those folks, they must struggle with it as well, right? And they have teams of writers behind them, and they get all this stuff, and yet they still don't always manage to be engaging. And part of it, and for us, we're not even entertainers, right? Nobody ever trained us or taught us, or it's sometimes not even something we want to think about. But what I like about this reading, and I'll tell you how this reading came to me, which is, I think, something important just before I get done here. What I like about it is she's talking about how inevitably reading aloud, you are an entertainer. And yet, it's not something you're not an actor on a stage, you're not on camera, which is a whole other thing, right? But you're an entertainer one way or another, whether you're doing it with your kid at night or whether you're doing it in front of a classroom. And so I think it really is a helpful way to be engaging. So that's, I think, one good reason about why you would want to do it. There's a question of when. And for me, beginnings are a big deal. And when we talk about being engaging, if you can be engaging at the start, and there's studies that show this, then you can probably keep on, you can buy a lot with that. I'll just give you another example. If I'm going to start out on the topic of the eye and how it works, this is what I read to my students. This is from a book called, I'm sorry I don't have the whole book, it's A Natural History of the Senses, but somebody liked it so much that they borrowed it, and it's been a while. Anyways, oh, and I should say, this woman, this book in general, Diane Ackerman, she's a synesthete, which is somebody who experiences their senses multiply. And of course, this happens to all of us, right? A smell elicits a memory of a vision, or you taste something and you're thinking about what it will feel like to be full and all this. But synesthetes are people who have this happen all the time. They might see the letter A and it's always green, or particular sound elicits a smell and those kinds of things. And then of course there are people who, and it's a very strange thing. It's remarkable. It doesn't happen more often. But then there's also, of course, it can become part of mental insanity, right? Because if it happens too often, then you can no longer deal with the world the way you should. And she's dealt with it by being an incredible writer who researches at scientific topics and really comes to understand them and is almost always right on, but then describes them with poetry. And this book, I think, is really her masterpiece because it deals with the senses. And that's what she understands a little bit differently than the rest of us. But here's what she says about vision. She says, the chapter is called The Beholder's Eye. She says, look in the mirror. The face that pins you with its double gaze reveals a chastening secret. You are looking into a predator's eyes. Most predators have eyes set right in the front of their heads, so they can use binocular vision to sight and track their prey. Our eyes have separate mechanisms that gather the light, pick out an important or novel image, focus it precisely, pinpoint in space, and follow it. They work like top-flight stereoscopic binoculars. Prey, on the other hand, have eyes at the sides of their heads because what they really need is peripheral vision so they can tell when something is sneaking up behind them. Though most of us don't hunt, our eyes are still the great monopolists of our senses. To taste or touch your enemy or your food, you have to be unnervingly close to it. To smell or hear it, you can risk being further off. But vision can rush through the fields and up the mountains, travel across time, country, and parsecs of outer space, and collect bushel baskets of information as it goes. Animals that hear high frequencies better than we do, bats and dolphins, for instance, seem to see richly with their ears, hearing geographically. But for us, the world becomes most densely informative, most luscious when we take it in through our eyes. It may even be that abstract thinking evolved from our eyes' elaborate struggle to make sense of what they saw. 70% of the body's sense receptors cluster in the eyes, and it is mainly through seeing the world that we appraise and understand it. Lovers close their eyes when they kiss because if they didn't, there would be too many visual distractions to notice and analyze. The sudden close-up of the loved one's eyelashes and hair, the wallpaper, the clock face, the dust motes suspended in a shaft of sunlight. Lovers want to do serious touching and not be disturbed, so they close their eyes as if asking two cherished relatives to leave the room. I just bought myself half an hour of going on about how the pupil regulates the amount of light and the lens focuses it and the retina translates that into a neural signal that's taken off to the brain because the students are already engaged, right? And it works that way. And I mean, I've seen it, I start reading that, and the students who, you know, the addicted texter will put down their smartphone, you know, or their phone, and their attention will be there. And there's a carryover for that. And I'll just say two more things and do two more readings that kind of show this. The big beginning, right, is the start of the semester. And that's the one where you've got 20 seconds. Salespeople say you have 7 seconds, okay? But probably after 20 seconds, the student's opinion about you and about the class and about whether they're going to be engaged and whether it's going to be interesting is probably done for the semester, and you can't blow it. And that's a lot of pressure. And I used to suffer with that one. And, you know, there's no one right way to do it. But for the last probably 10 years, the first words to my students in the semester have never been my own, and boy, does that take the pressure off. There's another part of that first part of the semester, which is, what do we want? So, and here, what do we want? That's also part of being a good teacher, right? Because we might want a lot of things too. But that's part of being a good teacher. And I think we want our students to learn. We might even want them to master the subject. And that's going to have a lot to do with knowing the subject and being organized and all those things. But if you ask most faculty, you know, when your student goes out the door and when they're in the workplace or just being a citizen or a member of society and they're doing what they do, and what do you want them to remember about your class? What do you want them to have taken with you? More often than not, sure, I want them to know how the eye works. But I also want them to know that we're predators and that we share an evolutionary history with other mammals that are predators and that we form part of a natural world. I want them to know and think about how the eye and visual information might be what actually evolved in conjunction with cognitive thought and how that allows us to deal with the world. And then there's probably even maybe something bigger that's even beyond that. Like, what's the ultimate message? Here's what I, for the last 7 or 8 years, read to my students the first words that come out of my class, out of my mouth. It's from a book called Complications, A Surgeon's Note on an Imperfect Science, and it's by a guy named Atul Gawande, who's a medical doctor. He's occasionally on the radio or TV as a commentator. He's been a consultant for Obama and other high-level politicians on healthcare policy. But he is a practicing physician, and when he wrote this book, he was a resident, a medical resident, and I think in Boston, I forget which hospital, busy hospital, an 80 to 100-hour intense job with 2 little kids at home, and he found the time to write what I think is just a brilliant and insightful work. And right there is a message for my students as they enter into A&P, which is going to be one of the, in any one of our courses, is going to be one of the intensive experiences of their life. And I say, you know, if he was that inspired, you know, intense times in your life can be very inspirational. And here's what he says. This is right from the introduction to the book. He says, I was once on trauma duty when a young man about 20 years old was rolled in, shot in the buttock. And right there, I've got everybody's attention, without a doubt, right? His pulse, blood pressure, and breathing were all normal. A clinical assistant cut the clothes off him with heavy shears, and I looked him over from head to toe, trying to be systematic but quick about it. I found the entrance wound in his right cheek, a neat red half-inch hole. I could find no exit wound. No other injuries were evident. He was alert and scared, more of us than of the bullet. I'm fine, he insisted, I'm fine. But on the rectal exam, my gloved finger came back coated with fresh blood, and when I threaded a urinary catheter into him, bright red flowed from his bladder as well. And if I didn't have their attention with the first sentence, now I definitely do, okay? The conclusion was obvious. The blood meant that the bullet had gone inside him through both his rectum and his bladder. Major blood vessels, his kidney, other sections of bowel may have been hit as well. He needed surgery, I said, and we had to go now. He saw the look in my eyes. The nurse is already packing him up to move, and he nodded almost involuntarily, putting himself in our hands. Then the gurney wheels were whizzing, IV bags swinging, people holding doors open for us to pass through. In the operating room, the anesthesiologist put him under. We made a fast, deep slash down the middle of his abdomen, from his rib cage to his pubis. We grabbed retractors, pulled him open, and what we found inside was nothing. No blood, no hole in the bladder, no hole in the rectum. No bullet. We peeked under the drapes at the urine coming out of the catheter. It was normal now, clear yellow. It didn't have a tinge of blood. We had an X-ray machine brought into the room and got X-rays of his pelvis, his abdomen, and also his chest. They showed no bullet anywhere. All of this was odd, to say the least. After almost an hour more of fruitless searching, however, there seemed to be nothing to do for him but sew him up. A couple days later, we got yet another abdominal X-ray. This one revealed a bullet lodged inside the upper right quadrant of his abdomen. We had no explanation for any of this, how a half-inch long lead bullet had gotten from his buttock to his upper belly without injuring anything, why it hadn't appeared on the previous X-rays, or where the blood we had seen had come from. Having already done more harm than the bullet had, however, we finally left it and the young man alone. We kept him in the hospital for a week. Except for our gash, he turned out fine. He goes on and says, medicine is, I have found, a strange and in many ways disturbing business. The stakes are high, the liberties taken tremendous. We drug people, put needles and tubes into them, manipulate their chemistry, biology, and physics, lay them unconscious, and open their bodies up to the world. We do so out of an abiding confidence in our know-how as a profession. What you find when you get in close, however, close enough to see the furrowed brows, the doubts and missteps, the failures as well as the successes, is how messy, uncertain, and also surprising medicine turns out to be. The thing that still startles me is how fundamentally human an endeavor it is. Usually, when we think about medicine and its remarkable abilities, what comes to mind is the science and all it has given us to fight sickness and misery, the tests, the machines, the drugs, the procedures. And without question, these are at the center of virtually everything medicine achieves. But we rarely see how it all actually works. You have a cough that won't go away, and then it's not science you call upon, but a doctor with good days and bad days, a doctor with a weird laugh and a bad haircut, a doctor with 3 other patients to see and inevitably gaps in what he knows and skills he's still trying to learn. And what that reading does for me, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, what makes a good reading, is it's clearly related to the subject matter, but it takes it a step beyond. And in this case, it takes me right to the central theme that I want to put to the students as they take that first step into my A&P class, which is that anatomy and physiology is a rite of passage into this world. And it's the rite of passage. It has been, and I talk about that. I'm not going to do this whole thing for you folks, but that's what it's been for 500 years, okay? Historically, and still is. I talk to my students about what I hate about teaching A&P, about what I love about A&P, but sort of my message to them on that first day of class is my fear that as they take that step into, step through the doorway or into the rite of passage, that it's a step down the road to dehumanizing who we are as we learn to name every single part of the body and how they all work, just like he's doing here, right, with the urinary catheters and pelvises and all that. And that if that's what they're going to do with the knowledge and that they learn, the power you get from the knowledge of being able to name every part of the body, if they're going to use that to dehumanize their future patients or dehumanize the people they know, as all too frequently happens in a medical setting, as we all know, then I've failed, right? And so my hope when he says how human medicine is that rather they use what they learn to be more human and to take and to use that power to appreciate that person who comes to them to lay open their deepest, darkest problems and sometimes secrets. And even though they can now name every part of the particular pelvic problem they have or head problem they have or whatever, that at the same time they're recognizing that this is a human endeavor and that they're using that power to treat that person as a human being. And so if I talk about what makes a great reading, it has to deal with the subject matter. So, you know, it can't be something random. It should go beyond. I think it should go beyond the subject matter. And it has to come to you. And do I have time to do one more? Or?
Marissa, you...
if I take like 5 more minutes, is that okay?
You good with 25 minutes?
Okay. And this last part, when students want us to be engaging and they want respect, you know, come on, nobody's doing this if they don't respect other people, I don't think. Or if you are, then come on, go get another job. That doesn't make any sense. And yet, how do you show that? I think that's the question, you know. It's not, do you respect your students? Of course you do. I mean, and like I say, if you don't, please, you know, find another job. But how do you show that? And if you come into the room and you say, oh, of course I respect everybody, and if that doesn't do anything, that says the opposite, right? If the institution says, oh, we value cultural diversity and we're a multicultural institution, guess what? That does the opposite. And there's studies that show it. It's how it is. So for starters, when you read something by a guy named Atul Gawande, and I didn't mention, who's of Indian descent, who's a medical doctor, who's at the highest levels of power in his profession, then that says something about who you respect, right? This is another reading that, this is a book, and I usually read something from this towards the end of the semester, and this is a book that everybody should read, I think, and certainly anybody who's going into health professions. That's what I tell my students. My brother, who happens to be an MD, keeps a stack of these in his desk drawer, and he runs a department for the VA in Tucson, and any new employee just gives them a copy. And the book is called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, and it happens to be by the same woman who wrote this, Confessions of a Common Reader. And the subtitle, Ann Fadiman, the subtitle is Among Child or American Doctors and the Collision of Two Cultures. And this is her masterpiece. She spent years researching this book, living in Merced, California, where there's a big population of Hmong people. And if you don't know about the Hmong, and she wrote this biography of this little Hmong girl whose name is Leah Lee. And the Hmong people come from the mountainous borderlands between Laos and Cambodia, and they were very affected by the Vietnam War. Their homeland was bombed, and many of them became refugees, and a lot of them came to the U.S. as refugee immigrants and settled. Then from a tropical country, settled in places like Minneapolis, Toronto, nice tropical cities. But many of them, because they're great farmers, and especially produce farmers, settled in California's Central Valley. And Leah Lee's family is was in Merced, California, which is in the Central Valley. And here's what I read to my students when, in the last week of A&P, when we talk about the brain and how it works. Some Hmong parents in Merced have given their children American names. In addition to many standard ones, these have included Kennedy, Nixon, Pajama, Guitar, Maine, after Merced's Main Street, and until a nurse counseled otherwise, Baby Boy, which one mother, seeing it written on her son's hospital papers, assumed was the name the doctor had already chosen for him. The Lees chose to give their daughter a Hmong name, Leah. Her name was officially conferred in a ceremony called a Hugh Plague, or soul calling, which in Laos always took place on the 3rd day after birth. Until this ceremony was performed, a baby was not considered to be fully a member of the human race, and if it died during its first 3 days, it was not accorded the customary funerary rites. Leah's Hugh Plague took place in the living room of her family's apartment. There were so many guests, all of them Hmong, and most of them members of the Li and Yang clans, that it was nearly impossible to turn Phua and now it was impossible to turn around. Phua and Nao Kao, her parents, were proud that so many people had come to celebrate their good fortune in being favored with such a healthy and beautiful daughter. That morning, Nao Kao had sacrificed a pig in order to invite the soul of one of Leah's ancestors, which was probably hungry and would appreciate an offering of food, to be reborn in her body. After the guests arrived, an elder of the Yang clan stood at the apartment's open front door facing East 12th Street with 2 live chickens in a bag on the floor next to him and chanted a greeting to Leah's soul. The 2 chickens were then killed, plucked, eviscerated, partially boiled, retrieved from the cooking pot, and examined to see if their skulls were translucent and their tongues curled upward. Both signs that Leah's new soul was pleased to take up residence in her body and that her name was a good one. If the signs had been inauspicious, the soul caller would have recommended that another name be chosen. After the readings of the auguries, the chickens were put back in the cooking pot. The guests would later eat them and the pig for dinner. Before the meal, the soul caller brushed Leah's hands with a bundle of short white strings and said, "I am sweeping away the ways of sickness." Then Leah's parents and all of the elders present in the room each tied a string around one of Leah's wrists in order to bind her soul securely to her body. Fua and Now Cow promised to love her. The elders blessed her and prayed that she would have a long life and that she would never become sick. And with your students, you can make the editorial comments, and this is one where I say, I'm not reading this to make you think what weird people these are. And if you have questions about this, just consider what it would be like for somebody who had no experience with it to come into one of the many different types of naming or, for instance, baptism ceremonies that might be more common in our particular part of the world, and think about, you know, how they would perceive that. They might think it's pretty strange. Anyways, I go on here that when Leah was about 3 months old, her sister Yura slammed the front door of the Lee's apartment. A few moments later, Leah's eyes rolled up, her arms jerked over her head, and she fainted. The Leahs had little doubt what had happened, despite the careful installation of Leah's soul during the Hugh Plig ceremony. The noise of the door had been so profoundly frightening that her soul had fled her body and become lost. They recognized the resulting symptoms as Kaugdab Peg, which means the spirit catches you and you fall down. The spirit referred to in this phrase is a soul-stealing dab. Peg means to catch or hit, and Kaug means to fall over with one's roots still in the ground, as grain might be beaten down by wind or rain. And I usually use that to my students as an intro to the brain, and just mention that what's going on with Leah Lee is the most common of neurological disorders. Then we go on and talk about the brain, and then I come back, and I'm not going to do the rest of the reading, but what Leah Lee has is epilepsy, and the whole book is about the way her culture perceives epilepsy, which has nothing to do with it being a disease. As the name says, it has to do with a spirit catching you and you're rooted in the ground and you fall over, and the way the doctors perceive it as a disease that you want to do anything to stop. And it's not Hollywood. It's a fascinating book. But what it also does is brings up the point of how important it is, right, for people with very different perspectives to respect each other, if you want to use that word, or to try and understand each other. And that's what education is about, and it's part of the bigger message that we have. And I'll just close you with this final thought. You know, if you think that this is something that would be interesting to you, this is just my experience, but the reading that I did to you initially about reading out loud, when Todd asked me to do this, and I said I'd do this, and I thought, well, how will I do it? I had given up on reading this book. I didn't like the first part of it, even though it's by the same author as this book I love. And the person who loaned it to me said, no, go on, the last essays are good. And the next day, having agreed to do this, I read this thing about sharing the mayhem. And that's the only, I think they have to come to you. And if I've tried it, like, oh, I want something about movement and how, you know, or Stephen Jay Gould, I'm going to look, must have written something about that. And they bomb. I don't know what it is, but in my experience, they have to come to you. That doesn't mean you can't be open to it. And of course, we're always open to things we can use in the classroom, but I think that's important. So, you know, take that as you will. I think it's a really great tool, and it works really well with the digital world, and I'll put links to those books on my website if you're interested in finding them. So I didn't quite get that done today. So thanks.